Welcome to this lesson on using volumes with containers. In this lesson, we'll be exploring one of the key concepts in containerization, persistent data storage. You'll learn how to create and manage volumes for your containers, and how this can improve your deployment efficiency and scalability. By the end of this lesson, you'll have a solid understanding of how to use volumes to persist data in your containerized applications. Now let's take a look at the learning objectives for this lesson. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to create and manage volumes for your containers using Docker. You'll understand the benefits of using volumes for persistent data storage, and how this can improve your deployment efficiency and scalability. We'll also be exploring best practices for using volumes in containerized applications. So, what are volumes? Volumes are directories that are shared between the host and the container. This means that any data written to the volume by the container will be persisted even after the container is stopped or deleted. Volumes provide persistent data storage for containers, which is essential for stateful applications that require data persistence. We'll be exploring how to create and manage volumes in more detail later in this lesson. Now, let's talk about why we use volumes. Volumes provide persistent data storage for containers, which means that any data written to the volume will be persisted even after the container is stopped or deleted. Volumes can also be used to share data between multiple containers, which is useful for applications that require data sharing. Using volumes can also improve deployment efficiency and scalability, as we'll see later in this lesson. Now, let's talk about how to create volumes. To create a new volume, you can use the Docker volume create command. You can specify the volume name and driver using the name and driver options. Once you've created a volume, you can use the Docker volume ls command to list all available volumes. And if you need to remove a volume, you can use the Docker volume rm command. Here's an example of how to create a new volume using the Docker volume create command. We're creating a new volume named myVolume using the name option. When you run this command, Docker will create a new volume with the specified name. Now, let's talk about how to list all available volumes. You can use the Docker volume ls command to list all available volumes. The output will include the volume name and driver. In this example, we can see that we have a volume named myVolume with the local driver. Now, let's talk about how to use volumes with containers. You can use the volume option to mount a volume to a container. You can specify the volume name and mount point using the volume option. Alternatively, you can use the mount option to mount a volume to a container. With the mount option, you can specify the volume name, mount point, and type. Here's an example of how to mount a volume to a container using the volume option. We're mounting the myVolume volume to a container using the volume option. The volume is mounted to the app directory in the container. When you run this command, you'll be able to access the volume from within the container. Now, let's talk about how to write to a volume from within a container. We can use the echo command to write to a file named hello.txt in the app directory. When we run this command, the file will be written to the myVolume volume. Now let's talk about some best practices for using volumes. You should use volumes to persist data that needs to be shared between containers. Using volumes can also improve deployment efficiency and scalability. However, you should avoid using volumes to store sensitive data. If you need to store sensitive data in a volume, make sure to use encryption to protect it. Now, let's talk about some common mistakes to avoid when using volumes. One common mistake is not specifying the correct volume name or mount point. Another mistake is not using the correct volume driver. You should also make sure to encrypt sensitive data stored in volumes and back up your volumes regularly to prevent data loss. Here's an example of how to back up a volume using the Docker volume save command. We're backing up the my_volume to a file named my_volume_tar. When you run this command, Docker will create a tarball of the volume and save it to the specified file. Now, let's talk about how to restore a volume from a backup. We can use the Docker volume load command to restore the my_volume from the backup file. When you run this command, Docker will load the volume from the specified file and restore it to its original state. Now, let's talk about some advanced volume management techniques. You can use volume labels to organize and manage your volumes. Volume labels are key value pairs that you can use to categorize and filter your volumes. You can also use volume filters to search and manage your volumes. And finally, you can use volume pruning to remove unused volumes and free up disk space. Here's an example of how to create a volume with a label using the label option. We're creating a volume named my volume with a label named inv and value dev. When you run this command, Docker will create a volume with the specified label. Now, let's talk about how to filter volumes using the filter option. We can use the filter option to filter volumes based on their labels. In this example, we're filtering volumes with the label nv and value dev. When you run this command, Docker will list all volumes that match the specified filter criteria. Now, let's talk about some common pitfalls and debugging tips when using volumes. One common mistake is not specifying the correct volume name or mount point. Another mistake is not using the correct volume driver. You should also make sure to encrypt sensitive data stored in volumes and back up your volumes regularly to prevent data loss. If you encounter any issues with your volumes, you can use the Docker volume inspect command to inspect the volume and diagnose the problem. Now, let's talk about some best practices and optimization techniques when using volumes. You should use volumes to persist data that needs to be shared between containers. Using volumes can also improve deployment efficiency and scalability. However, you should avoid using volumes to store sensitive data. If you need to store sensitive data in a volume, make sure to use encryption to protect it. By following these best practices and optimization techniques, you can get the most out of your volumes and improve the performance and security of your containerized applications. That's it for this lesson on using volumes with containers. We covered a lot of ground, from creating and managing volumes to using them to persist data. We also discussed some best practices and optimization techniques for using volumes. In the next lesson, we'll be covering advanced container networking topics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson.